Elyssa Goodman is a writer and photographer specializing in arts and culture. Her work has been published in Vogue, the New York Times Style magazine, Vanity Fair, and others. Elyssa has also written about LGBTQ plus history and culture for Conde Nast, where she was the site's drag Herstory and queer women's history columnist. She's been a freelance writer for 19 years and in love with drag for 28 years, since the age of 7. Her first book, Glitter and Concrete, A Cultural History of Drag in New York City, was published in 2023. Here's a clip about it.
There's a certain way the light hits a New York City sidewalk. A streak of glitter in the daytime, a mystical shine in the darkness at night that seems to transcend time. Suddenly, when that glitter appears on the concrete, there's a jolt of memory. Every pair of heels that's twinkled across its gleaming surface, every tattered Oxford, every chunky combat boot, every life that's come before. We're taught to believe glitter, like drag, is artificial. But when light hits the concrete just the right way, and so clearly sends sparkles flying, there's nothing more real.
Elyssa, come on in.
Hi, Amber. How are you?
I'm doing well. This is so good to talk to you. All right, you got infatuated with drag at a very, very early age.
Sure.
How did that happen?
I saw the film Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, and I believe it was on pay-per-view at the time. And that was it. To that point, my mother had raised me on 1950s movie musicals, and I loved the color and I loved the costumes. And so Tu Wong Fu sort of entering my orbit made perfect sense, except these were people who were here now. And I just loved them. I thought they were beautiful. My interest in it came, I think, at first from a design perspective. And then I fell in love with their warmth and their attitude and their outlook on life. And it's been a part of my life ever since.
When did you start writing? And tell me about your education in journalism.
Sure. I actually had a teacher in 4th grade named Susan Ludwig, who I'm still friends with, who pointed out the fact that I was a skilled writer in some way. And in the same way that I first encountered drag, I just ran with it. You know, she told my mother to encourage the writing, and she did. And here I am. My education in journalism started when I was, I guess technically probably in high school, but I always had an interest in writing nonfiction and reading it as well. I was the editor-in-chief of the yearbook, and I wrote for the local newspaper, which I did for many years. And when I got to college at Carnegie Mellon, I studied professional writing and creative writing, and I started a music magazine there. And then I just kept going. I moved to New York. I had a job in an office, and I got laid off, and I needed to figure out what to do. And I turned it into, originally it was social media, which at the time didn't mean what it means now. And I was writing and I was taking pictures, and eventually I phased out the social media, and I've been only a writer and photographer for actually about 10 years.
And so you used your history of knowing and liking drag and turned that into a career.
Pretty much, yeah. It's one of the many things that I write about. I usually say that I write about arts and culture, and then drag is one of the things that I write about under that, but it's absolutely a specialty within it. Yes.
Tell me about your work as a columnist for those magazines. What were your topics, and what were some of your favorite columns?
So I was the drag herstory columnist at Conde Nast's Them, and I wrote about drag of all different stripes of across the gender spectrum. And I think some of my favorite pieces were the ones where I got to learn something as well. You learn in the process of writing whatever you write, but it was fun to learn about people that I didn't know as much about. I think one of my favorite pieces was, and I knew about Stormé de Labier, but I was excited to learn about her background in the Jewel Box Review and being photographed by Deanne Arbus, and to encounter the photograph of her sitting on a park bench photographed by Deanne Arbus, which was really wonderful. And I loved it so much that I think made that the opening of the piece. And I loved writing the Charles Busch piece too. And Charles is now someone that I have known, and I interviewed him for this book. We were just on a panel together at the Brooklyn Book Festival. But at the time I knew him from Die Mommy Die, and not much else. So it was fun to be able to sit down and read his work and to watch it and to, make myself a student of his as well. Absolutely.
Charles Busch has been a guest here many times on Amber Live, and Russell and I have been in his apartment.
Oh, yes. Oh, I saw it on, was it Architectural Digest? I mean, it's magical.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Oh, it's even better in person.
A girl can dream.
So the history of drag, how far back do you go?
1865.
And why then?
I wanted the people that I wrote about to be as diverse as possible. And that was the time when there would have been people of as many ethnicities as possible on stages in the U.S. Due to the end of the Civil War. Mm-hmm.
And where do you find information about drag from 1865 or 1865?
Yeah, that's a great question. You have to do a lot of digging. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it too is to learn the different ways that drag was referred to and the different ways that it was consumed, which also played parts in how I was able to look for things. So for example, one of the people I found was a performer named Andrew Tribble, who he was a Black performer who started in minstrel shows, which unfortunately is how a lot of Black artists had to get their start at the time. And then once he moved north, he wore for a bit in a show in Chicago. He got into drag, and then the audience laughed so much that he kept doing it throughout the rest of his career. And he didn't only do drag, but he was an influential drag artist in his time. Absolutely. Even though it was coming from more of like a comedic perspective, this like a Mrs. Doubtfire or like a Milton Berle or something like that. But it's still an important part of drag history and all these different forms that all these different spaces that the form can live in.
Was drag underground, or was it part of the general entertainment venues?
Well, it depends on what year. So, for example, it was like a beloved form of theater. I would say until probably like just after the start of the 20th century. And what happened in the change was that women, mostly white women, received the right to vote. And it changed the relationship that ticket buyers, who were mostly men, had to seeing masculinity impersonated on stage. So in different points in history, it's gone up and down. And I mean, just like, I would say for probably like the 15 years that RuPaul's Drag Race has been on, like just in the last I don't know, what is it, like year or two that we've really had this national backlash. But that is unfortunately not unprecedented. It's something that happened after the Great Depression as well, after World War II, sort of in these times when men in power felt threatened, essentially, is what happened. There would be a backlash to anything that was outside of gender norms, and the sort of larger cultural experience was considered was maybe more conservative. So at those points, it would live underground. And I would say too, like the times when it was above ground, it had to be very clean and polished and designed for straight audiences to consume. And that was kind of the only way that it could survive for several decades, above ground anyway, in any kind of format. For example, there's there's a line in the chorus, in a chorus line, this very famous musical, where they're talking about the Jewel Box Review. And people may not know what that is now, but when the chorus line came out, and Bud Coleman writes an article about this that's very astutely observed, what he says is that, people knew what the Jewel Box Review was when a chorus line first came out. And this was a drag troupe that had been around for almost 40 years, So I would say it depends on the point in culture when you'd want to know if it was above ground or underground. And sometimes both, often both.
Now, many drag queens have started off as a drag performer, but then transitioned to women.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the case back in the early days of drag as well?
I think, well, I think the nature of how we talk about transitioning is a lot different now than it used to be. Right. And the way that a person would and could refer to themselves has changed a lot as well. So the language, for example, that a person might use at the time was lived as a woman, or lived as a man, whether or not there was medical transition involved of any kind. And that happens throughout history. Absolutely. I mean, I had someone ask me, do you have a separate section in the book for people who are transgender? And I said, no, absolutely not. You can't write this book without transgender people. Like, transgender people are woven through the fabric of this history, and I would never want to write it any other way. Yeah.
We've got many pictures from your book to show, but we're going to take a little break right now, but we'll be right back with Elyssa.
Great.
And we have tons of great t-shirts and bags and mugs, and we recommend that everybody check the store out because that helps us keep going too. We get a part of those proceeds to go to Amber Live and keep it going. And if you remember last week's guest, Paul Verberg, gave us a copy of his picture from a gay rodeo poster that he did back in the 80s. And he's allowing us to print that on products. And those are available in the store too. So go check all of that out after the show. But right now we're going to get back to part 2 of the interview.
Welcome back, Elyssa. Your book is full of pictures, and we've got some to show our audience right now. So, Russell, please put some pictures up. And Elyssa, tell us what they are.
Sure. So this is a photograph from an event called Night of 1,000 Stevies at Irving Plaza, and it's held by the Jackie Factory, which are people who used to put on an event here in New York, a party here in New York called Jackie 60, and it was a beloved downtown drag, music, theatrical, dancing, comedy experience. And Night of 1,000 Stevies is one of the events that they still do, even though Jackie 60 doesn't exist anymore. Chichi Valenti and Johnny Dynell. Yes, that's from the New York Burlesque Festival. One of the things I photograph in addition to drag is burlesque. I'm a big burlesque fan. And this is from one of the years at Brooklyn Bowl. This is the performer Tyler Ashley, also known as the Dauphine of Bushwick. This is at a brunch that Tyler and Charlene do at Superfine, and it's a drag brunch, and it's almost a marathon. It's very long. It's sometimes 4 or 5 hours, and it rains money on them. This is from a story I did about that drag brunch for Conde Nast. This is the performer Leave Alone, who at the time was performing with a group called Switch and Play. I'm not sure if they are still performing or I'm not sure if they're still performing, but this is them getting into drag. That is the performer Lucy Balls. Lucy Balls is I think by day works in fashion and design, and by night is a Brooklyn-based drag artist. And this is from a performance that she did at one of Untitled Queen's shows at the Rosemont that I wrote about for Hyperallergic. This is a performer, Candy Sterling, at Bushwig, and she's a phenomenal dancer. I'm not sure if she still performs. This picture's a few years old. But she killed it, and she's got these long legs, and she just kicks them into the sky, and it's magical.
So, Elyssa, Elyssa,
Yes.
there are many categories of drag queens. Do you cover them? I mean, there's the female illusionists, there's the glamour queens,
Yeah.
there's the clown queens.
Mhm.
What other categories can you think of?
Um, there's a look queen. There's we talked about comedy queen. We talked about there's the art girls. And there's I mean, and then there's also the same sorts of categories of drag king, right? And one of the things that I love about drag kings is that there you might have drag kings who like lean into the sort of macho aesthetic, or you have people who really embrace the sort of androgyny and gender ambiguity. And the Cake Boys are a drag troupe here in New York, and they have a phrase that they use that I've been hearing other people use, and they say drag thing also for performers who are non-binary and perform non-binary identity.
Oh, wow.
So there are many different facets of all of those things and all of these different styles of drag across the gender spectrum. Yeah.
Now, do you cover the drag king history as well in your book?
Absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't want to write a book about drag without acknowledging all the contributions that performers across the gender spectrum have made. Mm-hmm.
Moby Dick was a guest of ours a few weeks ago and gave us a great history of drag kings. Yes. Now, what about the ballroom scene in New York City in the 70s, 80s?
Yeah.
Tell me about that according to drag.
So what's interesting is that the ballroom scene sort of spawns from drag, but not everything now in ballroom is drag necessarily. There could be dance, there could be runway modeling categories. And not everyone is in drag. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But it very much comes from, if you've seen the 1968 documentary, The Queen, it comes from this last moment almost in the film of electricity, where Crystal LaBeija feels wronged by the pageant's results, and she storms off, and she's got a lot of words to say about how the pageant is rigged, and I'm not ashamed to show my color, like feeling that the pageant is racist. And one of the things that I heard that I really love that I write about in the book too is at the 50th anniversary of the Queen at Town Hall in 2018, the House of LaBeija came up on stage and they said, we create in part the ballroom scene as it exists now. We have it so we don't have to wonder. We don't have to. What am I trying to say? We don't have to think about why Harlow won. So we're all winners here, essentially. And if in the film, of course, the person who wins the pageant is Rachel Harlow, who is a white queen. And this is a space where you didn't have to worry about that anymore.
If anyone is unaware what the ballroom scene is, I highly recommend Paris is Burning, the documentary Paris is Burning, which is one of my all-time favorite documentaries. How did the onset of AIDS change the drag scene?
Well, one of the things it did is that it allowed people to see drag in a different way. And to that point, I think one of the performers, Glamamore, I spoke to for the book, said, at that point, doing drag was the wrongest thing you could possibly do, which is one of my favorite quotes from the book. And it wasn't something that people had a lot of respect for, whether it was, it was seen as trashy. It was, there was also probably some internalized homophobia involved in that. But during the AIDS crisis, the drag queens and kings created space for people to laugh and for people to enjoy themselves. And they were activists too. They were organizing benefits and they were doing charity performances. Right. They were going to hospitals. One of my favorite stories that Glamamore told me is of her and Connie Fleming, at the time Connie Girl, going to hospitals to visit people. And, the nurses were too scared to bring people's trays in. So they would bring them in, and they would make people laugh in the elevator, and they weren't scared, And that I think is it's an amazing contribution that they made, and people began, thankfully, to acknowledge that.
How has RuPaul changed the drag scene?
Well, I think one of the most important contributions that RuPaul's Drag Race has made is that it's created an appetite for drag outside of the drag bar. And I think what that does is it allows, as Linda Simpson says, it's a high tide raises all ships sort of situation. And I mean, what I've said in the past too is that, I wouldn't be able to write my book without the space that RuPaul has created, because this is, she has drummed up so much of this interest that there's created a market for a book like mine, essentially, and I think something that also happens is that, it makes drag accessible for a lot of people who may not have been able to see it otherwise, or to see it before they're 21 and going to a bar, or to see it, in some cases for free, depending on where you see it, or, if you're, what kind of streaming service you use, or on a cheaper basis anyway. And I think it allows it to be in more homes, and then I wish, I'm not going to say I wish, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I wanted people to know that there were stories of drag outside of the show as well. And there were styles of drag outside of the show as well.
Yes.
And that there's a long history of drag that got us to RuPaul's Drag Race. And one of the things I say in the book is, drag didn't need a television show to be the powerful art form that it is. It's great that it has one, but there's so much more than what meets the surface. A Trixie Mattel quote, actually, that I say a lot, or that I recite a lot, is that saying you love drag but you only watch Drag Race is like saying you love music but you only watch American Idol. It is the pop music representation of drag, but there are so many other genres as well.
Well, Elyssa Goodman, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating stories on the history of drag. And we have the address where people can find your book, and I'm sure many of our people will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Nice chatting with you, Amber.